They say blood is thicker than water, but I guess Andrew missed that memo. Growing up, my brother was the golden child. Andrew, the charmer, the go-getter, the one who could sweet-talk his way out of anything. I, on the other hand, was the quiet one, always taking the long route to success, even if it meant starting at the bottom of the ladder. I never resented him for it, not until the day he crossed the line. The day he stole Emma. Emma. The name still feels heavy in my throat when I think about her. She wasn't just my wife. She was my partner, my confidant, the person I thought would stick with me no matter how rough the road got. When I proposed to her, I had no fancy rings or a sunset backdrop, just my love and a promise. We'd make it through life together, hand in hand. And for a while, I thought that was enough. I thought she believed it too. But Andrew was always in the background, wasn't he? Flashing his tailored suits, his new cars, his carefree life that seemed worlds apart from the one Emma and I were struggling to build. I didn't see the way she started looking at him during family gatherings, the way her laughter became a little louder when he was around, or the way her smiles lingered in his direction. Maybe I didn't want to see it. Maybe I was too busy trying to climb out of the financial pit we were in to notice the cracks forming in our marriage. The first time I realized something was wrong, it was subtle. Emma started asking questions she hadn't before. Why don't we ever go on vacations like Andrew does? Or, do you think we'll ever afford a bigger house? At first, I chalked it up to frustration. I mean, who doesn't want more out of life? But the questions kept coming, sharper each time. And then one day, she didn't ask questions. She made statements. Andrew's life looks so much easier than ours, she said, her voice dripping with something I didn't recognize. Admiration? Longing? Whatever it was, it cut deeper than any argument we'd ever had. Then came the final blow. It was a Thursday evening. I remember because I'd just come home from a long day at work, exhausted and eager to unwind. Emma was sitting at the kitchen table, her hands clasped like she was about to deliver the news that someone had died. And in a way, someone had, our marriage. I'm leaving, she said, her voice so calm it sent chills down my spine. I can't do this anymore. I need more than this, Michael. More than you can give me. I should have fought harder. I should have said something profound to make her stay, to remind her of the promises we made. But all I could do was sit there, stunned, as she delivered the final nail in the coffin. It's Andrew, she confessed, as if saying his name would make the betrayal hurt any less. He understands me in a way you don't. He can give me the life I deserve, the life she deserved. What about the life we were building? What about the sacrifices I'd made, the sleepless nights spent trying to make ends meet? None of it mattered anymore. She'd made up her mind. The next few days were a blur. She packed her things and left, just like that. Andrew didn't even have the decency to face me. He sent me a text, "Sorry, man. I didn't mean for this to happen, but Emma deserves better." That text was the equivalent of a knife to the gut, and I felt every inch of it. My own brother, the person who should have had my back, had taken the one thing I thought I'd never lose. I can't tell you how many nights I lay awake, replaying every moment in my head. What could I have done differently? Was I really too poor, too ambitious, too me? The questions haunted me, and for a while, I let them. I let the pain consume me, let the bitterness fester like an open wound. My world shrank down to the size of my one-bedroom apartment, the place where echoes of Emma's laughter used to fill the air. But here's the thing about rock bottom. It gives you two choices. You either stay there, wallowing in your misery, or you claw your way back up. And Andrew? Emma? They'd given me all the fuel I needed to fight my way to the surface. Looking back, I can see it now. That moment wasn't just a betrayal. It was the catalyst. The fire that burned away everything holding me back, leaving me with nothing to lose and everything to prove. Losing Emma wasn't just a heartbreak. It was a reckoning. I wasn't just grieving the loss of my wife. I was grappling with the sheer audacity of my own brother, Andrew, the man who was supposed to have my back, not a knife poised to plunge into it. The betrayal left me stripped bare, staring at the ruins of my life and wondering if I'd ever rebuild. But here's the thing about being at your lowest. The only way out is up. At first, I wallowed. Who wouldn't? I spent days, no, weeks, drowning in self-pity. Every corner of my apartment reminded me of her. The chipped mug she refused to part with, the blanket she always wrapped herself in while watching TV. Even the silence was loud, echoing with what-ifs and maybes. Maybe I wasn't good enough. Maybe she was right to leave. But self-pity only gets you so far. One day, as I sat on my couch surrounded by unopened bills and empty takeout boxes, I caught a glimpse of myself in the mirror. My reflection was unrecognizable. A disheveled, defeated man staring back at me with hollow eyes. And just like that, something inside me snapped. This wasn't who I was. This wasn't who I wanted to be. That's when I made a decision. I wouldn't let their betrayal define me. If Emma thought I wasn't good enough, fine. If Andrew believed I'd never measure up to his flashy lifestyle, fine. But they wouldn't get the satisfaction of being right. The first step was the hardest. I quit the dead-end job I'd been clinging to for far too long. I'd always played it safe, choosing stability over risk, but where had that gotten me? Nowhere. So, I took a leap. I packed up what little I had and moved to a new city. A place where no one knew me, where I could start fresh. I found work at a small tech startup, a position that paid far less than I was used to, but offered something far more valuable: potential. The hours were grueling, the learning curve steep, but I threw myself into it with everything I had. Every late night, every setback, every failure only fueled me more. I wasn't just working for a paycheck. I was working to prove something, to myself, to Emma, to Andrew, and to anyone who had ever doubted me. Of course, it wasn't all smooth sailing. There were days when the weight of it all felt unbearable. Days when I questioned if I'd made the right choice, if I was chasing a pipe dream. But then I'd think about Andrew's smug grin, his condescending words, "Some people just aren't cut out for success, Michael." Those words haunted me, but they also drove me. I'd repeat them in my head like a mantra, twisting the knife just enough to keep me moving forward. Then, something unexpected happened. At a networking event, one I almost didn't attend because I was exhausted and convinced I didn't belong, I met Grace. She wasn't like Emma. Where Emma had been all polished edges and lofty expectations, Grace was raw, real, and unapologetically herself. She was an entrepreneur, someone who had built her success from the ground up, and she saw potential in me that I didn't even see in myself. We started talking, first about work, then about life. She told me about the struggle she'd faced, the sacrifices she'd made, and for the first time in a long time, I felt seen. She didn't pity me or try to fix me. She simply believed in me, and that belief was contagious. Grace became my anchor. She pushed me to dream bigger, to take risks I never would have considered before. With her encouragement, I pitched an idea to my company, a revolutionary app that streamlined project management for small businesses. It wasn't an overnight success, but it was the start of something. The app gained traction, and within a year, I was promoted to a leadership role. By the time Grace and I started dating, I wasn't just surviving, I was thriving. Together, we built something incredible, not just professionally but personally. For the first time in years, I felt like I was enough. Not because I'd reached some arbitrary level of success, but because I was finally living authentically, on my own terms. Andrew and Emma? They were still a shadow in the back of my mind, but they didn't haunt me the way they used to. I wasn't out for revenge. I didn't need it. My success, my happiness, was proof enough that their betrayal hadn't broken me. But life has a funny way of bringing things full circle. I had no idea how soon I'd be forced to confront the ghosts of my past, or how satisfying it would be to finally close that chapter of my life. They say time heals all wounds. I say time simply numbs the sting, but the scars? They stay. I'd moved on, or so I told myself. Life was good, better than I could have ever imagined. Grace and I had built not just careers, but a partnership rooted in mutual respect and love. Yet, when the invitation to the family dinner arrived, all those old wounds flared up like they'd never left. It was a casual message from my mother, typed out in her usual mix of emojis and exclamation points. "Michael, we're having a family dinner next Saturday. Everyone will be there. It's been too long. Can't wait to see you." My initial reaction? Delete. Ignore. Pretend I never saw it. Why should I subject myself to an evening of Andrew's smug face and Emma's forced smiles? I owed them nothing, least of all my time. But Grace had other ideas. She caught sight of the message and raised an eyebrow. "You're going," she said matter-of-factly. I laughed, thinking she was joking. She wasn't. Why would I go? What could I possibly gain from sitting across the table from them? Grace leaned back in her chair, arms crossed, her expression unreadable. "Because it's time, Michael. You've spent years building this incredible life, but you're still carrying them around like baggage. This isn't about them. It's about you. Go, show them who you've become, and let that be the end of it." She had a point, of course. Grace always did. But knowing she was right didn't make it any easier. For days, I wrestled with the idea, flipping between defiance and reluctant acceptance. By Friday night, I'd convinced myself to go, but only because Grace promised to join me. "We'll make an entrance they won't forget," she said with a sly grin. That, at least, gave me some comfort. Saturday arrived, and with it, a knot in my stomach that refused to go away. As we drove to my parents' house, Grace could sense my tension. She reached over, her hand warm and steady on mine. "Whatever happens, I've got your back," she said softly. It was all I needed to hear. The house hadn't changed much. Same brick exterior, same slightly crooked mailbox. But stepping through the front door felt like walking into a time capsule. The smells of roasted chicken and baked potatoes greeted me, along with my mother's enthusiastic hug. "Michael, you look so good. And Grace, you're stunning as always," she gushed, oblivious to the undercurrent of tension I felt creeping in. And then I saw him, Andrew, sitting at the dining table, drink in hand, leaning back like he owned the place. Emma was next to him, her smile as brittle as ever. She glanced at me, then quickly looked away. Good. Let her squirm. "Michael," Andrew drawled, rising to his feet. "It's been a while." "Not long enough," I muttered under my breath, but Grace squeezed my hand, reminding me to keep my cool. We took our seats, and the small talk began. My mother chatted about the neighborhood. My father chimed in with updates about his garden, and Grace charmed everyone with her wit. But Andrew, he couldn't resist taking jabs. "So, Michael, still tinkering with those little projects of yours?" he asked, smirking. I didn't take the bait, responding with a polite, something like that. The real punch came when Andrew raised his glass and said, "You know, some things never change. Isn't that right, Michael?" His tone dripped with condescension, and the room fell quiet. Even Emma shifted uncomfortably in her seat. Everyone was waiting for my response, but I didn't rise to his level. Not yet. Instead, I smiled, a calm, measured smile that I knew would unnerve him. "You're right, Andrew," I said evenly. "Some things don't change. But some things, well, they change in ways you'd never expect." The tension in the room was palpable, but I didn't elaborate. Not yet. Let him stew in the uncertainty. Grace gave me a subtle nod, her silent way of saying, "You've got this." As the dinner continued, I could feel Andrew's eyes on me, searching for cracks in the armor I'd spent years fortifying. But there were none. I was no longer the man he could belittle or overshadow. And deep down, I think he knew it. The evening wasn't over yet, and neither was my part to play. What Andrew didn't realize was that the best moments of the night were still to come. The dining table stretched before us, adorned with dishes my mother had spent all day preparing. Her signature roast chicken, mashed potatoes, and a pie that still carried the warmth of the oven. It was the perfect picture of family tradition, yet the air crackled with tension, thick and inescapable. My mother, ever the peacemaker, flitted around the table, oblivious to the storm brewing beneath the surface. Andrew, of course, had claimed the head of the table, leaning back in his chair with the smugness of a king surveying his kingdom. Emma sat beside him, her eyes darting around the room like a cornered animal. She barely looked at me, though her cheeks flushed whenever Grace spoke. I could see the weight of unspoken words pressing down on her, but this wasn't the time for sympathy. "Michael," Andrew called, breaking the uneasy silence as he swirled the wine in his glass. "It's good to see you're still keeping busy." It was a loaded comment, designed to jab at the man he assumed I still was, the one he thought he'd left behind in the ashes of his betrayal. I didn't bite. Instead, I smiled, the kind of smile that says, "I know something you don't." "Busy is an understatement," Grace interjected, her tone light yet commanding enough to turn heads. "Michael's been doing some incredible things lately." I could see the flicker of irritation in Andrew's eyes. Grace was an enigma to him, someone he couldn't categorize or control. He didn't know who she was, not yet, and that gave her an edge. "Oh, really?" Andrew leaned forward, his smirk growing. "And what kind of things are we talking about?" Before I could answer, Grace placed a hand on my arm, her touch grounding me. "We'll get to that," she said with a smile so serene it was almost unsettling. "Let's not rush the evening." Andrew didn't like being put on pause, but what could he do? Grace had effortlessly taken control of the room, and for once, he wasn't the center of attention. The conversation turned to safer topics: my mother's new gardening project, my father's plans to renovate the garage, but Andrew couldn't resist taking subtle digs. Every comment was a thinly veiled attempt to remind me of the man I used to be, broke, struggling, outshined by his wealth and charm. "Do you remember that time you tried to fix the family car and ended up making it worse?" Andrew laughed, turning to Emma. "Michael always had these big ideas, but never quite the means to pull them off." The table chuckled politely, but my mother shot me a worried glance. I could see her pleading with her eyes. "Don't let this escalate." But I wasn't about to take the bait. I leaned back in my chair, meeting Andrew's gaze with a calm eye I'd spent years cultivating. "Big ideas take time," I said evenly. "But when they pay off, they're worth the wait." Andrew's smirk faltered, just for a second. He wasn't used to this version of me, the one who didn't flinch under his jabs. Emma shifted uncomfortably beside him, her hands twisting in her lap. She hadn't said much all evening, and I could tell she was torn between curiosity and guilt. The weight of her choices hung between us like a shadow, but I wasn't here to rehash the past. Grace, ever the strategist, decided it was time to turn the tables. "So, Andrew," she began, her tone casual but her eyes sharp, "how's work been treating you?" Andrew straightened, clearly eager for the chance to boast. "Work's been great," he said, launching into a monologue about his latest ventures. I tuned him out, watching as Grace nodded along, her expression polite but unreadable. When he finally finished, Grace tilted her head, as if considering something. "That's interesting," she said, her voice laced with a subtle challenge. "It's always fascinating to see how people navigate uncertain times." Andrew blinked, clearly thrown off by her remark. He opened his mouth to respond, but my mother interrupted, announcing that dessert was ready. The timing was impeccable, and I couldn't help but smirk. As the pie was served, Andrew turned to me with that same smirk he'd worn for years. "You know, Michael, some things never change. No matter how much time passes, you'll always be," he trailed off, letting the implication hang in the air. I held his gaze, my expression steady. "You're right," I said softly, my voice carrying an edge that silenced the room. "Some things never change. But some things, well, they change in ways you'd never expect." Andrew frowned, confused, but I didn't elaborate. Not yet. The night was far from over, and the best part was still to come. Grace gave me a knowing smile, her hand brushing against mine under the table. The stage was set, and I was finally ready to deliver the performance of a lifetime. The hum of conversation filled the room as dessert plates clinked and chairs creaked. Andrew's smug remarks were still bouncing around my head, but I wasn't rattled. No, I was waiting for the perfect moment, the one that would leave him speechless for the first time in his life. Grace must have sensed my thoughts because she leaned in, her voice low and steady. "Whenever you're ready," she whispered, a hint of a smile tugging at her lips. It wasn't just encouragement. It was a promise that she had my back. Always. Andrew was in the middle of another self-congratulatory story, something about his latest, brilliant investment, when I decided it was time. He was gesturing dramatically, basking in the attention, when I calmly set down my fork and cleared my throat. "Andrew," I said, my tone light but deliberate. "You've had a lot to say about me tonight, about what hasn't changed. But there's something I think you've missed." He raised an eyebrow, clearly amused. Oh, and what's that? I let the moment hang, savoring the anticipation. Then I smiled and said, "Meet my wife." The room fell silent as every pair of eyes turned toward Grace. She sat back in her chair, poised and composed, her presence commanding without effort. For a few seconds, Andrew looked at her, confused. Then recognition dawned, and his smirk crumbled faster than a house of cards in a storm. "You," he stammered, his voice barely above a whisper. "You're—" "That's right," Grace said, her voice cutting through the tension like a blade. "I'm your boss." Andrew's face turned a shade of pale I didn't think was possible. He blinked rapidly, as if hoping this was some kind of elaborate prank. But the look on Grace's face left no room for doubt. Emma, sitting beside him, looked equally stunned, her mouth slightly open as she glanced between the two of us. "You didn't know?" Grace asked, tilting her head slightly, her tone almost mocking. "I assumed it would have come up by now. After all, we've been married for 2 years. Andrew's eyes darted toward me, his expression a mix of disbelief and fury. "You married her?" he hissed, his voice low but venomous. I didn't flinch. "That's right. And let me tell you, Andrew, it's the best decision I've ever made." My mother, oblivious to the history Grace and I shared with Andrew, clapped her hands together. "Oh, isn't this wonderful? A family connection at work. How lucky you are, Andrew, to have such a supportive boss." Grace smiled, but there was steel behind it. "Yes, Andrew. Very lucky." Andrew's composure was slipping, and for the first time, I saw a crack in the mask he'd worn for years. He shifted uncomfortably in his chair, glancing at Emma, who seemed to be shrinking into herself. She hadn't said a word, her face a canvas of emotions, regret, shame, and something that looked a lot like longing. "What's wrong, Andrew?" I asked, feigning innocence. "You've been so talkative all night. Surely you have something to say now." He opened his mouth, but no words came out. Instead, he reached for his glass of wine, taking a long, shaky sip. The rest of the table was watching in stunned silence, unsure of how to react. My father, ever the diplomat, tried to break the tension with a chuckle. "Well, isn't this a small world? What are the odds?" Grace leaned forward slightly, her gaze locked on Andrew. "You know, it's interesting," she said, her tone deceptively casual. "When I first met Michael, he told me about his family. About you, Andrew. I never imagined I'd end up working with you. But life is full of surprises, isn't it?" Andrew's jaw tightened, his knuckles white as he gripped his glass. He was cornered, and he knew it. The power dynamic he'd relied on for years was gone, flipped on its head in a single evening. "And you know what the best part is?" I added, my voice steady and calm. "All those years you spent looking down on me, telling me I'd never measure up, they didn't break me. They made me stronger. And now, here we are." The weight of my words hung in the air, each one landing like a punch. Andrew didn't respond. He couldn't. For the first time in his life, he had no retort, no clever comeback to save face. Grace stood, her movements graceful yet deliberate. "Well, this has been lovely," she said, addressing the table. "But we should be going. Michael and I have an early start tomorrow." I rose as well, offering my mother a warm smile. "Thanks for dinner, Mom. Everything was delicious." As we made our way to the door, Andrew finally found his voice. "Michael," he called, his tone strained. I paused, turning to face him. His eyes met mine, and for a brief moment, I saw something I'd never expected: fear. "Why didn't you tell me?" he asked, his voice barely above a whisper. I held his gaze, my expression unreadable. "Because you didn't deserve to know." With that, Grace and I walked out, leaving Andrew and Emma to sit in the wreckage of their own making. It wasn't about revenge, it was about closure. And for the first time in years, I felt free. The drive home after that dinner was quiet, but not the heavy kind of quiet. It was the kind of silence that feels like a weight has been lifted. Grace reached over, her fingers intertwining with mine, and I knew she was proud of how everything had unfolded. But deep down, I wasn't done yet. Andrew might have been silenced at the table, But the wheels in my mind were still turning. Days turned into weeks, and the fallout from the dinner began to unravel in the most poetic way. Andrew had been coasting in his career for years, relying on charm and connections to maintain his position at Grace's company. He wasn't bad at his job, but he wasn't exceptional either. Grace, on the other hand, was exceptional at spotting mediocrity. A month after the dinner, she came home one evening, her expression unreadable. "We're restructuring," she said casually, setting her briefcase down. I raised an eyebrow. "Restructuring?" She smiled, but it didn't reach her eyes. "Andrew's division has been underperforming for a while now. We've decided it's time for a shake-up." I didn't press for details. Grace never mixed business with personal matters, and I respected that. Still, I couldn't help but feel a twinge of satisfaction. Andrew had spent years tearing others down to prop himself up. Now, he was standing on shaky ground, and it was only a matter of time before it crumbled beneath him. 2 weeks later, it happened. Grace's company announced a series of layoffs, and Andrew's name was on the list. I didn't hear it from him, of course. No, Andrew wasn't the type to admit defeat, especially not to me. Instead, I got the news from my mother. "Michael," she said over the phone, her voice tinged with worry. "Have you spoken to your brother lately? He's been going through a tough time." I leaned against the kitchen counter, a part of me tempted to play dumb. "A tough time? Why's that?" She sighed, the kind of sigh that only a mother can manage, full of disappointment and concern. "He lost his job. He's been so stressed." Emma mentioned they're thinking about selling the house. Selling the house. The irony wasn't lost on me. The very life Andrew had flaunted as superior to mine was slipping through his fingers. But I didn't gloat. Not outwardly, anyway. "That's unfortunate," I said, keeping my tone neutral. "I hope he lands on his feet." My mother hesitated, clearly hoping I'd offer more. "Maybe you could talk to him? You know, give him some advice. You're doing so well now, and he could use the support." I nearly laughed at the absurdity of it. Andrew, the man who had taken so much from me, now needed my help, but I bit my tongue. "I'll think about it, Mom," I said, before quickly changing the subject. A few days later, Andrew called me himself. I hadn't heard his voice since the dinner, and it was strange to hear him so subdued. "Michael," he began, his tone lacking its usual bravado. "I just wanted to say, I'm sorry." The words hung in the air, and for a moment, I wasn't sure how to respond. Andrew didn't apologize, not unless there was something in it for him. "Sorry for what?" I asked, my voice calm but pointed. "For everything," he said after a pause. "For what happened with Emma, for the things I said over the years. I was wrong. I didn't soften. Not yet. And what made you realize that?" He hesitated, then sighed. "Grace, that dinner. It made me see how much I've messed up. You've built a life I could only dream of, and I ruined mine." It was a moment I'd fantasized about for years, Andrew admitting his mistakes. But now that it was here, it felt hollow. His apology wasn't for me. It was for him, a desperate attempt to ease his guilt. "I appreciate the apology," I said finally. "But let's be clear, this isn't about comparing lives. This is about choices. You made yours, and I made mine. The difference is, I took responsibility for mine." Andrew didn't argue. He simply muttered a quiet, "I understand," before hanging up. That was the last time we spoke. From what I've heard, he and Emma sold their house and moved into a smaller place. He's trying to rebuild, but without the safety net of his charm or family connections, it's an uphill battle. Do I feel sorry for him? Not really. Andrew's downfall wasn't about karma or revenge. It was about inevitability. You can't build a life on arrogance and entitlement without it eventually collapsing. As for me, I've moved on. Grace and I continue to thrive, both in our careers and in our marriage. Every now and then, I think about Andrew and Emma, but not with anger or resentment. Instead, I feel a quiet sense of satisfaction, knowing that I rose above their betrayal and built something real, something lasting. In the weeks following the dinner, the power dynamics between Grace and Andrew shifted from subtle tension to outright discomfort, for him, at least. Grace, ever composed, treated Andrew no differently at work than she would any other employee. But I knew her well enough to recognize the precision with which she wielded her authority. She wasn't vindictive, but she didn't ignore incompetence either. And Andrew? He'd made his career on charm, not results. One Friday evening, Grace and I were sitting in the living room, enjoying a quiet moment together, when she glanced at me with a faint smile. "You know," she began, her tone casual, "Andrew's department has been struggling with their quarterly targets." I raised an eyebrow, sipping my coffee. "Struggling how?" She leaned back, her expression thoughtful. "Poor leadership, missed deadlines, lack of accountability. It's been going on for a while, but after the restructuring, it's become glaringly obvious." I could feel the gears turning in her mind, but I didn't press. Grace didn't mix business with personal matters lightly, and if she brought this up, it wasn't just idle chatter. "Let me guess," I said, setting my mug down. "You've got a plan." Her smile widened, but she didn't confirm or deny it. Instead, she shifted the conversation, leaving me to wonder what she had in store. The following Monday, I heard the first ripple of her plan during a phone call with my mother. "Andrew's been so stressed lately," she said, her voice laced with concern. "Apparently, there's been talk of some big changes at his company. He's worried about what it might mean for him." I didn't let my tone betray anything. "Big changes, huh? Well, sometimes change is necessary." My mother sighed. "I just hope he can handle it. You know how he is. He's not used to being under this kind of pressure." That much was true. Andrew thrived when he could control the narrative, but Grace's restructuring had shifted the spotlight onto his actual performance, a far less flattering view. 2 weeks later, Grace came home with an update. "We had a meeting today," she said, setting her bag down and slipping off her heels. Andrew was there. I glanced up from my laptop, curious. "How'd it go?" She smirked, grabbing a glass of water. "He's feeling the heat. The numbers don't lie, and he knows it." I laid out the expectations for his department moving forward, and let's just say he didn't take it well. I couldn't help but chuckle. "What did he say?" "Oh, nothing directly," she replied, sitting beside me. But his face said everything. He's not used to being held accountable, and it's throwing him off balance. I leaned back, a sense of satisfaction washing over me. "You're not going easy on him, are you?" Grace tilted her head, her expression calm but resolute. "I treat him the same as everyone else. If he can't meet the expectations, that's on him." It was a simple statement, but it carried the weight of inevitability. Andrew had spent years coasting on charisma, but now he was being measured by results, and coming up short. The turning point came during a company-wide presentation. Grace invited me to attend as a guest, a gesture that wasn't lost on Andrew. I could see the tension in his jaw as he spotted me in the crowd, his polished exterior beginning to crack. During the presentation, Grace outlined the company's vision for the next quarter, emphasizing the need for strong leadership and accountability. Her tone was professional, but her gaze lingered on Andrew just long enough to make her point clear. When it was Andrew's turn to speak, the contrast was glaring. His presentation lacked focus, his confidence faltering under the weight of Grace's scrutiny. By the time he finished, the room was silent, not out of awe, but discomfort. Afterward, I caught up with Grace in the hallway. "That was intense," I said, unable to hide my amusement. She shrugged, her expression unbothered. "It's not personal. It's business. If he can't rise to the occasion, someone else will." Andrew's downfall wasn't dramatic. It was gradual, like a slow-motion collapse. Over the next month, his department continued to falter, and Grace's patience wore thin. Eventually, the decision was made. Andrew would be reassigned to a lower position, one that better suited his skill set, or lack thereof. When the news broke, my mother called me in tears. "He's been demoted, Michael," she said, her voice trembling. "This is going to crush him." I listened quietly, offering vague reassurances. What could I say? Andrew's downfall was of his own making. Grace hadn't set out to punish him. She'd simply held him to the same standards as everyone else. The difference was, Andrew had spent years avoiding accountability, and now it had caught up to him. In the end, Grace didn't have to do much. Andrew's own shortcomings did the heavy lifting. But watching it all unfold, I couldn't help but feel a sense of poetic justice. The man who had spent years tearing me down was now struggling to keep himself afloat, and it wasn't because of me. It was because of him. I'd be lying if I said watching Andrew's downfall didn't bring me some sense of satisfaction. After all the years he spent looking down on me, flaunting his so-called superiority, life had handed him a mirror, and the reflection wasn't kind. But satisfaction isn't the same as peace, and I hadn't truly found closure. Not yet. The opportunity came on a cloudy afternoon when Andrew called me, his voice more subdued than I'd ever heard it. "Michael," he began, hesitating as though the words weighed too much. "Can we meet? Just the two of us." My initial reaction was to decline. What could he possibly say that would make a difference now? But Grace, always the voice of reason, encouraged me to hear him out. "Closure isn't for him," she reminded me. "It's for you." And so, a few days later, I found myself sitting across from Andrew at a quiet cafe. He looked different, thinner, almost gaunt. The sharp suits and cocky grin were gone, replaced by a man who seemed lost, unsure of himself. For a moment, I almost felt sorry for him. Almost. "Thanks for coming," he said, fidgeting with his coffee cup. His usual confidence was nowhere to be found. "I'm here," I replied, my tone even. "What do you want to say?" He sighed, running a hand through his hair. "I've been thinking a lot about everything. About what I did to you, to Emma, to our family. I know I can't undo it, but I wanted to say I'm sorry." The words hung in the air, and for a moment, I wasn't sure how to respond. I'd waited years to hear those words, but now that they'd been spoken, they felt hollow. Apologies were easy. What mattered was what came next. "I appreciate the apology," I said finally, "but let's not pretend this is just about Emma. You've spent your entire life putting yourself above others, Andrew. This isn't just about what you did to me. It's about the choices you've made over and over again." He flinched, but he didn't argue. "I know," he said quietly. "I've been selfish, arrogant, and now I'm paying for it." I studied him, searching for sincerity. He seemed genuine, but I couldn't forget the years of condescension and betrayal. Forgiveness wasn't going to be easy, but holding on to resentment wouldn't make me any happier. "I've moved on," I told him. "I have a life I'm proud of, a wife who supports me, and a career I've built from the ground up. Your choices don't define me anymore, Andrew. They never did." He nodded, his eyes downcast. "I'm glad you're doing well, Michael. You deserve it." For the first time, there was no sarcasm in his voice, no underlying smugness. It was a small victory, but it felt significant. As we parted ways, I didn't feel the sense of triumph I thought I would. Instead, I felt lighter, as though a weight I hadn't realized I was carrying had finally been lifted. Andrew would have to face the consequences of his actions on his own, but I was done letting him take up space in my life. That evening, as Grace and I sat on the couch, I told her about the meeting. She listened quietly, her hand resting on mine. When I finished, she smiled. "So, how do you feel?" I thought about it for a moment. "Free," I said. "I feel free." She leaned her head on my shoulder, and for the first time in years, I felt like I could finally leave the past behind. Andrew and Emma were chapters in my story, but they weren't the whole book. My life, my happiness, was something I'd built on my own terms. Closure wasn't about getting an apology or seeing Andrew brought low. It was about letting go. And as I sat there with Grace, I knew I'd finally done just that. As Grace and I drove home from that pivotal meeting with Andrew, a sense of clarity washed over me. For the first time in years, the weight of the past felt like it had been lifted from my shoulders. The bitterness I'd carried, the resentment, the anger, it all seemed to dissolve into the quiet hum of the car's engine. Andrew's apology didn't erase the pain, but it gave me something I hadn't realized I needed: closure. That evening, Grace and I shared a simple dinner at home. It was nothing elaborate, just the two of us at the kitchen table, laughing over shared stories and plans for the future. Grace was the kind of person who didn't just walk into your life. She transformed it. She made the everyday extraordinary, and she reminded me, constantly, of the strength it took to rebuild and thrive. After dinner, As we sat on the couch, Grace reached for my hand. "How do you feel?" she asked, her eyes searching mine. I took a moment to consider the question. "Lighter," I admitted. "Like I've finally put it all to rest." She smiled, her grip on my hand tightening slightly. "Good. You deserve that." In the weeks that followed, life continued to move forward, but this time, it felt different. The specter of Andrew's betrayal no longer loomed over me. I stopped thinking about what I'd lost and started focusing entirely on what I'd gained. My business was flourishing, Grace's career was thriving, and together, we were building a future filled with possibilities. One sunny afternoon, Grace surprised me with an idea that caught me off guard. "Let's take a trip," she said, her excitement contagious. "A trip?" I asked, raising an eyebrow. "Where to?" "Anywhere," she replied, grinning. "Someplace we've never been. Just you and me, no distractions. Let's celebrate everything we've accomplished." The idea was appealing. It wasn't just about the destination. It was about marking the start of a new chapter. A chapter where the ghosts of the past no longer held sway, where the focus was entirely on the life we were creating together. We chose a small, picturesque town nestled in the mountains. It was the kind of place where time seemed to slow down, where the air was crisp and the scenery breathtaking. For a week, we left behind the pressures of work and the noise of the world, immersing ourselves in the simplicity of each other's company. One evening, as we sat by the fireplace in our cozy cabin, Grace looked at me, her eyes reflecting the flickering flames. "Do you ever think about what would have happened if things had turned out differently?" she asked. I knew what she meant. If Andrew hadn't betrayed me, if Emma had stayed, if the life I thought I wanted had actually come to pass. "I used to," I admitted, "but not anymore. If things had turned out differently, I might never have met you, and that's not a life I'd want." She smiled, her expression softening. "Good answer." The trip was more than just a getaway. It was a reminder of how far I'd come, of how much I'd overcome. When we returned home, I felt a renewed sense of purpose. The life Grace and I were building wasn't just about material success. It was about the intangible things, love, respect, partnership, that truly made it meaningful. Months later, I heard through the family grapevine that Andrew and Emma had moved into a modest apartment in the city. He was working for a smaller company now, far from the high-powered executive role he once flaunted. Emma, according to my mother, seemed different, quieter, more withdrawn. I didn't ask for details. Their lives were no longer my concern. As for me, I stopped looking back entirely. The scars Andrew and Emma had left were still there, faint reminders of a painful past, but they no longer defined me. Instead, they served as proof of my resilience, my ability to rise above and create something extraordinary. Grace and I often talked about the future, about expanding my business, starting new ventures, maybe even starting a family one day. The possibilities felt endless, and for the first time in my life, I wasn't afraid to dream big. Looking back now, I realized that Andrew's betrayal wasn't the end of my story. It was the beginning of a journey that led me to a life richer and more fulfilling than I ever could have imagined. And as Grace and I stood side by side, ready to face whatever came next, I knew one thing for certain. This chapter was only the start of something incredible,